Okay, well, thank you very much, and I apologise for my late arrival. I'm Adam Fagan, Regional Politics from Queen Mary University of London. Firstly, let me say that I find this research report absolutely fascinating, and I've been involved in two research projects, which I'll hopefully talk about in the presentation, which have looked at the impact of EU assistance on civil society actors and NGOs in Bosnia and Serbia. And I used more specifically in the second project, a larger project, we looked at environmental governance and the building of environmental governance, the role of NGOs and civil society actors in that process. So I want to talk about both of those projects. I want to talk, I suppose, as academics foolishly do, a little bit about our methodology and some of the kind of conceptual ideas, which I think are important, because I think there has been a huge change in how we see civil society and how we see dialogue between state and non-state actors. And then I'll want to move on and present some of my findings, and then if I have any time left and I'm not being nudged to shut up, I'll offer some data as well, but I'll wait and see. Okay, well, firstly, I'll put self-promotion on my book that really says it all, really, I suppose, in terms of my perspective, not says it all by any means, but says everything I've got to say at the moment about this. Is Europe's Balkan Dilemma, Parts of Civil Society State Building, in which is based on the project, a 3-year project, where I interviewed and analysed the impact of the EU assistance as part of CARDS and initiatives in Bosnia, Serbia, and also briefly in Kosovo. I just want to begin really with looking back at the critical literature on civil society assistance in post-socialist, post-communist Eurasia, and to confess immediately that I contributed to some of this negative literature, and in a sense what I've spent my time doing recently is criticising some of my own findings and destroying my own earlier work, which I see as an exercise in objectiveness and the rest of it, but nevertheless. I think, let me start by saying that what we were very critical about was the role of these new NGO networks that had emerged as a consequence of first US funding and other funding, but more recently EU funding, which we believed were, or we felt were disconnected from indigenous networks. I think we then were concerned about external assistance failing to generate advocacy networks. We were concerned that donors, and particularly the EU, through their short-term projects, were building project management capacity, i.e. a capacity to manage a 12-month, 18-month project, but not building political capacity, or what I would refer to as governance capacity. We were concerned about a lack of accountability and legitimacy, and of course this old chestnut of dependency on donors. Once the donors withdrew, once the assistance came to an end, what sustainable legacies would there be in terms of civil society dialogue and civil society capacities? And I think we were concerned primarily because it was not entirely positive news or message coming out of Central and Eastern Europe, new member states of 2004, in terms of once the donors withdrew, there didn't seem to be an awful lot in evidence from this long-term funding that had taken place. And we were concerned, well, certainly political scientists and the like were concerned about what we saw as a democratic deficit, particularly low levels of participation. That if this, what masqueraded as civil society, NGOs, really didn't seem to be fulfilling the most basic democratic or political criteria, which was the ability to mobilise citizens and to mobilise public voices. And that seemed to concern us very much. And I think the picture that was painted was of these organisations hovering on one hand between elites, not quite institutionalised as elite level, but also failing on the other side to actually mobilise people. We were then concerned with a lack of transnational linkage and global network formation. Because I think the EU certainly, and other donors as well, really emphasised very early on that what their funding initiatives were designed in part to generate a level of regional cooperation and to somehow connect these NGOs with pan-European organisational networks. Now, there is some positive evidence from Central and Eastern Europe, particularly around EU initiatives and particularly around environmental initiatives, of that taking place. But I think it's only fair to say that it all happened rather late, and with obviously the benefit of hindsight, we can say, well, this was very successful, but it wasn't necessarily particularly effective very early on. Finally, the other concern that we had as political scientists and commentators was that these successful NGO networks, those NGOs that seem to be doing best and making the most use of their assistance, were those that were engaged in service provision. And our concern was that they were actually substituting for the state and therefore perpetuating state weakness by taking on functions that should have been done by the state, or that they were substituting, particularly in the Western Balkans, for the lack of market penetration and privatisation, etc. In other words, we were very dismissive of service provision because we saw it as not really about civil society and civil society dialogue and politics and what have you. And as I said, I contributed to that and probably got an awful lot of it wrong. But I'm correcting myself as time goes on and with the help of reports like this. But I think where we got it wrong was that we expected far too much. We expected far too much of these non-state actors and non-civil society organisations, but importantly, we tended, for some reason, to see them as agents rather than conduits of change. And we had absolutely no historic model there, or normative benchmark to draw on. If we look at kind of Tocquevillian models of civil society or associational activity, at no point does anybody really talk about civil society taking on this very dominant role as agents of change. Secondly, we were very keen to judge the impact of assistance, particularly EU assistance, far too early. We weren't really giving it a chance, we weren't recognising, we were looking for a kind of instant hit that wasn't happening. Thirdly, and I think this is perhaps my main point really at the moment, is that this lens of democracy and civil society didn't really help us. It was a half-open shutter, a half-open lens, because what it did was it made us almost fetishise participation. We were obsessed with how well these civil society organisations could mobilise people. And it obscured a critical behind-the-scenes governance role, the sort of thing that we're talking about here, which is a kind of dialogue role, which I refer to as a kind of transactional capacity. And I think, fourthly, we were too dismissive of service provision. We saw it as somehow apolitical and not appropriate, but in actual fact, what it's proving to be is the basis of a kind of legitimation. It's a building up of knowledge, of respect in communities, and I think it's absolutely critical. And finally, related to that point, we underestimated the extent to which these NGO networks, however lacking in capacity they were at a certain point, were actually the basis or the grassroots of a new epistemic community. They represented new policy knowledge that needed nurturing very carefully. Now, a little bit more summarising, but it's only a brief moment, and that is these two projects. The first one, as I said, ran from 2004-2007, assessment of EU capacity systems for NGOs, and then the second one, which is just coming to an end, has been a very large 3-year project, a little bit unruly in some ways, if the truth be told, but a very interesting amount of data that has been generated, which is this ECOBAS, EU compliance in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia, where we used environmental governance as a lens on civil dialogue. And we're particularly looking at the building of Corridor 5C, this trans-European road network, and public hearings, environmental impact assessment public hearings that take place. And these are the questions we ask here. To what extent is EU compliance and soft conditionality triggering new modes of environmental governance? What roles do civil society actors but increasingly important, what role do international financial institutions play in environmental